The night shift started the same way it always did, fluorescent lights humming like electricity given sound, the antiseptic smell sharp enough to cut, Margaret Walsh clocking in at 11:16 p.m. with her grey hair pinned tight and her scrub spotless. 11 years. She'd been invisible for 11 years, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The badge clipped to her collar read RN, nothing more, nothing less. No titles. No history. Just Margaret, the quiet nurse who moved through Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah like she was part of the infrastructure, as necessary and unremarkable as the ventilation system. She didn't exist anywhere else. Not in the Pentagon's databases, those records had been erased. Not in the news archives, Operation Nightingale had been classified so deeply that even the people who'd authorized it pretended it never happened. Captain Margaret Walsh had died in a field hospital near Bagram Air Base in 2009, bleeding out under mortar fire while extracting wounded operatives. The woman who clocked in tonight was someone else entirely. Someone smaller. Someone safe. The locker creaked when she opened it, the same hinges that had been squeaking for 7 years. She hung her jacket on the same hook, arranged her things in the same precise order, phone on the shelf, watch in the small box, shoes aligned at 90-degree angles. And there, in the corner where no one ever looked, the folded flag. White cloth folded into a tight triangle, the way the Arlington Honor Guard folded them for families who'd lost everything. This one had come with a handwritten note on a 3x5 card, the edges worn soft from being read too many times. Margaret didn't read it anymore. She'd memorized it in 2011. She pressed her hand against the flag for exactly 3 seconds, the way she always did, then closed the locker and headed for the ICU. Pain was information. Grief was data. Both could be compartmentalized if you had enough training. The hallway at midnight smelled like cleaning solution and the faint staleness of recirculated air. Her footsteps were silent, good boots, well broken in, the soles worn to rubber that didn't echo. She'd learned to move quietly at Fort Bragg, back when she was someone else, someone who trained to operate in darkness. 12 years of active duty. 3 classified deployments. 2 Purple Hearts she'd never claimed because claiming them would require a discharge record that didn't exist. The Pentagon had erased her the way you'd erase a security breach, incomprehensively, irrevocably, with prejudice. It wasn't a punishment exactly. It was what you agreed to when you signed up for the kind of work that the government couldn't acknowledge. The kind of work that happened in villages that didn't appear on official maps, where the rules of engagement were written in blood and necessity instead of regulation manuals. When that operation in Bagram had gone sideways, when the extraction had become an active firefight, when she'd had to use a combat knife to perform an emergency thoracotomy on a ranger who'd taken a round through the lung, the Pentagon had 2 choices: honor her service or erase it. They'd chosen erasure. It was cleaner that way. So now she was a nurse. Just a nurse. For 11 years, no one had questioned it. She pulled up the patient roster on the computer in the ICU station. Room 337, post-op abdomen. Room 339, pneumonia, improving. Room 341, cardiac monitoring, stable. Room 343, sepsis protocol, antibiotics running. Room 345, orthopedic recovery. Room 347. New admission. She clicked on the name. Master Sergeant Colin Reeves. 53 years old. Admitted 6:15 p.m. with multiple lumbar compression fractures, shattered L2 vertebra, incomplete spinal cord injury. Prognosis: mobility severely limited, chronic pain management ongoing, psychological evaluation recommended. The chart noted depression, refusal of pain management, requesting DNR status, do not resuscitate. Code status, limited measures only. Margaret's hand stopped moving. She could feel her heart rate staying exactly the same, which meant nothing in her body was reacting, which meant she was already in operational mode. Compartmentalization engaged. Affect dampened. What emotion was, what it usually was for other people, was locked away in a room in her mind that she'd stopped visiting a long time ago. She stood up from the computer and walked toward room 347. The hallway was quiet this hour, just the low hum of monitors and the distant beeping of a ventilator in the post-op unit. Her eyes had adjusted to the fluorescent lighting years ago, the way soldiers adjusted to any environment they were placed in. She could see in this light the way other people saw in daylight. She could move through it like it was forest instead of hospital corridor. Room 347 was dark except for the monitor lights. A man lay in the hospital bed, his face thin from pain, his shoulders broad even diminished by months of deterioration. His right hand was clenched on top of the blanket. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep, she could tell by the tension in his jaw, the way his breathing was controlled instead of relaxed. A man lying awake in the dark, not wanting anyone to know he was conscious. She'd seen that same pose in field hospitals. Soldiers who decided they were done fighting. "Captain," she said quietly. No expression. No inflection. Just the word, low and clear. His eyes opened. The pupils tracked to her face, and something shifted in them, a flicker of recognition, then confusion, then something like the moment before a man realizes he's being hunted. His hand moved toward the call button. "Easy," she said. "Still quiet. I'm the night nurse. Name's Margaret." He stared at her for a long moment, his breathing still controlled, his eyes still analyzing. She could see him running facial recognition in his mind, matching her face against memories from Kandahar, from the command briefings, from a decade ago when he'd been standing in a village compound with her son, watching the dust settle from the explosion that had killed 3 Marines. "I knew your boy," he said finally. His voice sounded like gravel and rust. "I know," Margaret said. She pulled the privacy curtain closed, letting the monitor light cast its blue-green glow across his face. He watched her move around the room the way people watched surgeons, with the careful attention of someone who knew their life was in another person's hands. She checked the 4-line, verified the fluid rate was correct, glanced at the medication list. Everything standard. Everything by protocol. Everything that said she was just another nurse doing her job. But something in how she moved, the economy of motion, the lack of any wasted gesture, told him different. "You're going to get better," she said. Still quiet. Still without inflection. "No," he said. "I'm not." She didn't argue. That was a conversation for later, if he was lucky enough to have a later. Instead, she adjusted the bed height by 3 degrees, checked the catheter line, verified the monitor leads were secure. Her hands moved like they'd been doing this work for decades, which they had, not in a hospital, but in field conditions that were infinitely more chaotic. Hands that had held a severed artery while a medic searched for a clamp. Hands that had performed an emergency thoracotomy while mortar rounds impacted 50 meters away, the percussion pushing air through the tent walls. "You knew my son," Reeves said. "Not a question." "Battalion level," she said. "Medical attachment." It was mostly true. Close enough to truth to hold. She moved to the locker and opened it, putting her personal items in the same place she always did. Her jacket on the second hook. Her phone on the shelf. And then, while Reeves was watching, she reached back and touched the folded flag for exactly 3 seconds before closing the door again. When she turned back, his eyes were wet. "He was a good soldier," she said. "The best kind." "How do you?" Reeves started, then stopped. Understanding moved across his face like a shadow. "You sent it?" "No," she said. "You did." She checked his vitals one more time, verified the 4 medication running at the correct rate, a morphine drip, 2 milligrams per hour, inadequate for pain but adequate for the half-death he was choosing. She made a note in the chart. Then she turned to leave. "Wait," Reeves said. "What's your last name?" Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, her hand on the frame, her face in profile against the hallway light. For a second, just for a second, something in her posture changed. Something in the line of her shoulders that suggested the woman standing there had once commanded rooms full of soldiers, had once made decisions that determined whether people lived or died, had once been someone other than a night shift nurse with spotless scrubs and invisible hands. "Walsh," she said quietly. She left before he could respond, before he could say the name back to her and make it real, before the 11 years of careful invisibility could shatter under the weight of one piece of history walking into a hospital room at midnight. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that someone else had seen her. Someone who saw her every morning, who watched the way she moved through the ICU like she owned it, who recognized competence when it walked past him carrying a blood pressure cuff instead of a credential he understood. Dr. Mercer was standing at the nursing station when Margaret returned from room 347. He was reading the admission notes for the new patient, his face arranged in a kind of professional interest that masked something darker. When he heard her footsteps, he looked up, and his eyes went to the chart in her hands. "The Reeves admission," he said. Not a question. A statement, the kind of statement that carried weight. "Stable," Margaret said. She placed the chart in the rack. "You've been in there 14 minutes, he said. "For a simple vitals check." Margaret didn't respond. She didn't have to. She'd learned in Bagram that silence was a more powerful tool than words. Silence forced other people to fill it, to reveal what they were really asking beneath the surface question. Mercer smiled. It wasn't a warm expression. "I'm going to need you to stay away from that patient's care." "He's in my assignment rotation," Margaret said quietly. "Not anymore," Mercer said. His voice dropped to the tone doctors used when they were exercising authority, the tone that assumed everyone around them understood the hierarchy. "I'm reassigning him to the day shift. Nursing preference. His chart, his medications, his monitoring, all of it goes to day shift, effective immediately." She could have argued. She could have cited protocol, could have pointed out that patient care continuity was a medical best practice, could have filed a complaint. But she didn't. Because she understood what was happening. She understood that Mercer had seen something in her, not her competence exactly, but the confidence that came with competence that didn't require his permission. She understood that men like him recognized instinctively when they were standing next to someone who couldn't be controlled through credential or hierarchy. And she understood that this was only the beginning. Margaret Walsh turned back to the patient roster without responding, her face composed, her breathing steady, her hands still as stone. She'd weathered worse than this. She'd survived Bagram. She'd survived the Pentagon's erasure. She'd survived 11 years of invisibility. She could survive a doctor's resentment. What she didn't know was that Reeves had heard everything. What she didn't know was that a man who was ready to die had just been given a reason not to. What she didn't know was that in the next 72 hours, he would code. And when he coded, he would become the reason everything changed. The first sign that Dr. Mercer had decided to destroy her came quietly, the way all truly dangerous things do. Margaret was setting up Sergeant Reeves's medication cart in room 347 when Mercer appeared in the doorway, his white coat pressed with knife-edge precision, his voice smooth as silk poured over glass. He'd corrected his dosage in front of an intern, a simple catch, a standard safety check that any competent nurse catches 100 times a year. But Mercer had felt it as an insult. A man whose power rested entirely on the assumption that everyone around him was lesser doesn't accept correction. He accepts it the way a shark accepts a smaller fish challenging its territory. Captain Walsh, he'd said, and the way he'd loaded that rank, not title but accusation, told her everything. He'd done his research. He knew exactly who she'd been, what the rank meant, and he'd weaponized it into something contemptuous. Not her name. Not Nurse Walsh. Captain Walsh, as if the rank itself was proof of her delusion, her inability to accept her current station. By the second week, his campaign had spread through Cedar Creek Medical like oil on water, quiet and pervasive and impossible to wipe clean. The rumors started small. Margaret had falsified a patient chart. Margaret cut corners on post-op monitoring. Margaret thought her military background, said with a curl of his lip, meant she understood medicine better than people who'd actually earned their credentials. He whispered these stories to the right nurses, the ones closest to the unit manager, the ones whose opinions carried weight. He never said them directly. He was too intelligent for that. He'd corner Dr. Patricia Hastings, the attending who'd worked alongside Margaret for 7 years, and say things like, "I've noticed some inconsistencies in the documentation from night shift. Nothing I can prove yet, but it concerns me." The word yet hung in the air like a threat. Within 3 weeks, the break room had become a geography of exile. Margaret would arrive at 11:30 for her lunch, the fluorescent lights humming their institutional dirge, and watch the careful choreography of abandonment. Nurses she'd trained, women she'd stayed late to help through their own family crises, would be sitting at the table with their containers of pasta and rice, their phones glowing in their hands. They'd see her arrive. Their conversations wouldn't stop, they weren't crude enough for that. Instead, they'd simply gather their things. One would mention she needed to check on a patient. Another would remember paperwork. Within 90 seconds, Margaret would be alone at the table, the smell of antiseptic and old coffee surrounding her like a moat. One night, a younger nurse named Claire, barely 5 years on the unit, trained by Margaret herself through a rough pediatric rotation, passed her in the hallway outside the supply closet. Margaret had smiled at her, a small gesture, nothing more. Claire had whispered as she passed, "Ghost." Not with cruelty. With something worse. With pity. Margaret had continued walking, her hand steady, her breathing even, her face a perfectly composed mask. But that word had found its mark in a way that Mercer's rumors never could. Ghost. Someone who was there but unseen. Someone who'd already been erased. The irony would have been beautiful if it hadn't been devastating. The written warning appeared on the unit board on a Tuesday morning, timed perfectly for the shift change when 40 nurses would pass through the break room within the span of an hour. Margaret read it once, her eyes moving across the words with the same mechanical precision she'd learned in a field hospital outside Bagram, when reading reports meant sorting who was salvageable and who wasn't. The notice was dated 3 days earlier but posted now, public execution by bureaucratic procedure. Margaret Walsh, written warning for insubordination and failure to follow chain of command. Incident, correcting attending physician's medication protocol without authorization. Escalation pattern, multiple instances of questioning medical decision-making. Recommendation, mandatory retraining on hospital hierarchy. Dr. James Mercer, MD. Her jaw set once. Just once. Then she took the notice down from the board, carried it to the unit manager's office, placed it on the desk, and said quietly, "This should be in my personnel file, not posted where everyone can read it." The manager, a woman named Sandra who'd never made direct eye contact with Margaret since Mercer's campaign began, had the decency to look embarrassed. "I'll have it filed properly," she said. Margaret had nodded and walked back out. She returned to room 347 where Sergeant Reeves sat in his wheelchair, his shattered spine making him a permanent resident of machinery and pain, his eye still carrying the clarity of someone who'd commanded men in places where clarity was the difference between living to see your daughter graduate and not. He was watching the doorway when she came in, and she knew immediately that he'd heard about the written warning. In a hospital, secrets traveled faster than any bloodborne pathogen. "You're the captain," he said. Not a question. A statement from someone who recognized bearing when he saw it. "I was," Margaret replied, checking his full line though it didn't need checking. She was giving herself something to do with her hands. "Long time ago. Your boy was under my command in Kandahar. 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company." Reeves's voice was quiet, but it carried weight, the kind of weight that only came from having made impossible decisions and lived with them. "I sent you something." A flag. Margaret's hand stilled on the fall line. She didn't turn around. "I know. He saved 3 Marines before the IED got him. Kid had that same thing you do. That calm. Like he'd already accepted the worst, so nothing could surprise him anymore." Reeves paused. She could hear him breathing, the slight whistle of damaged lung capacity. "You're going to save my life or you're going to stand there taking it from a man who doesn't know the difference between competence and arrogance. I've seen both. You're the first." Margaret turned to face him then. His daughter had gone down to the cafeteria. His wife was dead 5 years from cancer. He was alone in this room except for her, a nurse he'd never met before this admission, a woman whose son had died under his command. The weight of it, the specific gravity of that connection, that moment, hung between them like the smell of antiseptic that could never quite wash away blood from Bagram dust. "You'll be okay," Margaret said. It wasn't a promise. It was something else. A statement from someone who'd seen the worst and refused to pretend it meant anything but what it meant. Mercer found her at 11:47 that same night, in the medication dispensary, checking the stock of epinephrine. He arrived with purpose, his movements sharp, his face flushed with the kind of anger that expensive education sometimes mistook for authority. "You took that notice down," he said. "Not a question." "It was posted improperly." Margaret didn't look at him. She was counting vials, her movements precise and mechanical. "That notice was necessary documentation of your pattern of behavior." His voice had that oiled quality again, the false precision of someone reading from a script he'd written for himself. "Your file is developing a very concerning trajectory, Nurse Walsh. Insubordination, falsified documentation, unsafe practice patterns. I have concerns about your competency." Margaret set the vial down. She turned to face him, and in that moment, something shifted in the small room, the air pressure changing the way it changes before lightning, everyone in the radius suddenly aware that the ground has become unreliable. "You mistake your authority for competence, Doctor," she said, and her voice had dropped half an octave, a register she didn't use around hospitals. "One you were given. The other you'll never have." She walked past him then, her shoulder brushing his white coat with enough firmness that he stumbled backward, and she didn't stop. She walked out of the medication dispensary, down the corridor toward the ICU where Reeves was sleeping, his monitors beeping their steady rhythm, and she left Mercer behind her with his face the color of old blood. What she didn't know was that 72 hours had become 36. The pulmonary embolism was building in Reeves's damaged system, a slow accumulation of clot and time, and Mercer's pride wouldn't allow him to admit that she'd been right about anything, let alone about the most important thing. The ticking clock wasn't just ticking anymore. It was counting down. The alarm screamed at 2:33 a.m. Not the routine code alert that came every few nights, the ones that sometimes resolved with a few compressions and a burst of epinephrine. This was the full orchestra, the code blue alert that made every cardiac nurse in Cedar Creek Medical move toward room 347 like iron filings to a magnet. Margaret was on the surgical floor 3 stories up when she heard it, restocking the trauma bay after a routine appendectomy, and her body knew before her mind did. "Reeves!" The words came to her without thought, muscle memory of watching a monitor that refused to cooperate, of a man who'd commanded her son with the kind of quiet authority that meant he understood sacrifice. She moved toward the stairwell. The ICU was 2 floors down, and taking the elevator would cost 30 seconds she didn't have. Her badge clattered against her sternum as she ran, the metal striking her collarbone in rhythm with her heartbeat. The stairs were concrete and fluorescent, each landing blurring past. Her hands had already started running through the differential, what kills a disabled veteran overnight, and the answer crystallized with the clarity of a sniper's focus: pulmonary embolism. Blood clot. Massive. The kind that doesn't announce itself with warning signs. The kind that just stops a heart. The ICU entrance required a key card. She swiped it. Red light. Access denied. The restriction was new. Mercer's work, obviously, the final escalation of his campaign to erase her from every layer of Reeves's treatment. She pressed her palm against the reinforced glass window and saw him there in room 347, not the competent emergency physician who should have been running the code, but Dr. Mercer himself, his silk tie still tied despite the hour, his hands gesturing as he barked orders at a code team that moved like marionettes with tangled strings. "Compressions, now," he commanded. A nurse began chest compressions, arms pumping with mechanical force. "Stop. Stop. I need to see the monitor." The nurse stopped. 20 seconds of no blood flow to the brain. Epi. 1 milligram for push. A resident fumbled with the medication, hands shaking. "No, calcium first." "No, compressions again." Different approach. The team pivoted, confused, each order contradicting the last like he was conducting an orchestra where he'd never learned the score. The monitor showed asystole. A flat line. No rhythm. No heartbeat. No life. Just the machine's dead whisper and the ambient hiss of the ventilator trying to inflate lungs that belonged to a corpse. And then Margaret heard something else, a sound like breaking glass made of human voice. Reeves's daughter was screaming somewhere in the hallway, the kind of scream that came from watching the last piece of your world die in front of you. Margaret shoulder-checked the emergency exit, triggering the alarm that shrieked through the corridor like a wounded animal. The door swung open. She ran. Security was coming, she could hear their radio traffic, the calm dispatch voice calling for assistance at the ICU breach, but she had maybe 8 seconds before they arrived. She pushed into room 347 and the chaos stopped like someone had hit pause on the world. "Get her out," Mercer snarled, his face flushed with rage and something uglier, panic. The knowledge that he was losing control of the narrative, that Reeves was dying under his command, and that Margaret Walsh had just walked into his operating room. She didn't respond to him. She didn't even acknowledge him. She moved to the crash cart with the fluid grace of someone who'd done this in desert field hospitals with Taliban mortars shaking the ground around her, with sand in the wounds and blood that wouldn't stop flowing, and her hands, scarred from 17 years of trauma and classified operations that existed only in redacted government files, found the scalpel. Not the small one for precision work. The larger one. The one that could cut through the ribcage of a dying man fast enough to save him. She looked at Mercer once. Just once. The cold stare, not angry, just empty of fear, that belonged to someone who'd already accepted every consequence of what she was about to do. Court-martial if necessary. Prison if that was the price. The loss of a license she'd obtained through back channels and classified authorization. None of it mattered. One man was about to die because a doctor's ego had strangled the code, and she had sworn an oath that transcended hospital policy. "Move or watch him die," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. "Choose fast." Mercer's face went white. His hands dropped. He stepped back, and in that moment, he saw her for the first time, not as the invisible night nurse he'd been destroying, but as something that had no name in his vocabulary. Something that didn't freeze under authority. Something that made the air pressure change just by existing. Margaret cracked Reeves's chest with a thoracotomy that would have looked like butchery to anyone who didn't understand that speed was mercy. The scalpel sliced through skin and fascia and muscle with movements precise as surgery under mortar fire, her hand steady as someone who'd done this 1,000 times in different light and different countries and different uniforms. She spread the ribs with a spreader from the cart, her palms pressing against wet bone and the copper smell of blood that was still warm. There. The heart. The useless, stopped, failing heart of a man who'd been strong enough to carry wounded soldiers through the mountains of Kandahar. She placed her hand directly on the organ and began to massage it. Not the violent fist pump compressions of standard CPR, those were for closed chest work, but the deliberate, methodical manual compression that required access and authority and hands that knew the exact pressure a human heart could tolerate before it ruptured. Her fingers found the rhythm, squeezing gently but firmly, coaxing the muscle to remember what it had forgotten. The monitor showed nothing. Then a flutter. Then asystole again. Then a beat. The machine stuttered like a man coughing in the dark, and suddenly the monitor showed a rhythm. Not perfect. Not strong. But alive. The line began to climb, climbing, sinus rhythm establishing itself like a commander reasserting control over chaos. Reeves gasped. His body convulsed as his lungs remembered oxygen, as his brain remembered consciousness, as the man who'd survived the worst his nation could throw at him refused to die in a hospital bed because a surgeon's pride had strangled the emergency. Margaret stepped back. Her scrubs were painted red, blood on her hands and forearms and across her chest like the uniform of someone who'd just fought death and won. She was breathing steady, not hard, not panicked, just the measured respiration of someone who'd done what needed doing and accepted the cost. Security burst through the door, hands reaching for her, and she didn't resist. She simply looked at the monitor one more time, at the rhythm that meant Reeves had survived another day, and allowed herself to be taken. Mercer was staring at his shoes. He didn't look at Margaret. He didn't look at Reeves. He looked like a man who'd just watched his entire world shift on its axis and realized the axis had never been his to hold in the first place. The room was silent except for the monitors and Margaret's steady breathing, and somewhere in that silence, something had changed. The invisible nurse had done something invisible men weren't supposed to do. She'd saved a life using skills that proved she'd never been invisible at all. By dawn, Dr. Mercer's office looked like a legal war room. 17 pages. Each one stamped, initialed, dated with the precision of a man weaponizing bureaucracy. Unauthorized medical procedure. Practicing beyond scope of licensure. Endangering patient welfare. Falsification of incident reports. Assault on hospital staff during code response. Every accusation crafted to sound clinical, surgical, unarguable, the words of a doctor defending institutional safety, not a man covering his incompetence. He cited obscure hospital regulations. Paragraph 7.4.3 of the Credentialing Bylaws. Section 12.1 of the Nursing Practice Standards. Code 14.2 regarding unauthorized interventions. Each regulation a brick in a documentation fortress so dense, so meticulously constructed, that it didn't matter whether the accusations were true. The structure itself became the truth. The weight of paperwork became the weight of evidence. Mercer had learned long ago that truth was negotiable, but procedure was sacred. Procedure could not be questioned because it was already written down. The hospital administrator, Gerald Holloway, read through the complaints in his office on the 4th floor, the one with the mahogany desk and the view of Forsyth Park. He was a man whose job depended on liability management, risk aversion, and the careful distancing of Cedar Creek Medical from anything that looked like negligence or scandal. Mercer had done something brilliant. He'd made Margaret Walsh the liability instead of himself. 17 pages of complaints. Each form another nail. Each regulation another reason to remove her from the premises before she could be questioned about what had actually happened in room 347 at 2:24 a.m. By 9 a.m., Holloway had signed the termination letter. At noon, Margaret was called to the administrative office. She walked up the stairs without hurrying, her grey hair pinned tight, her scrubs still bearing the faint stains of the code team's failure. Holloway sat behind his desk. Mercer stood beside him, face composed, eyes satisfied. The letter lay on the desk like a knife. Effective immediately, Holloway said, not meeting her eyes, your employment is terminated pending investigation. We've received multiple complaints regarding unauthorized medical intervention, scope violations, and... Margaret picked up the letter. Read it. Set it down. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. I saved his life. That's not the point, Mercer said smoothly. The point is procedure. The point is that you exceeded your authority, and in doing so, exposed this hospital to significant liability. Margaret turned to look at him. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to Holloway. The epinephrine dosage you gave him would have stopped his heart faster than the embolism did. I corrected it. He lived. Mercer's jaw clenched. That's exactly the kind of insubordination I documented. But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She was already thinking about what came next. She turned in her badge without a word. The laminated rectangle with her photo and RN, night shift, Cedar Creek Medical felt thin as a playing card in her hands. She cleaned out her locker in the break room while 3 nurses pretended to look at their phones. The photograph of her son. The box containing the folded flag from a fallen teammate, pressed into her hands 11 years ago by the man she'd just saved. She left the scrubs hanging on the hook. Reeves's daughter found her in the hallway. Thank you, the girl said, eyes bright with something like anger. You saved him. You saved my father. Margaret nodded once and kept walking. She didn't trust her voice. She never did when gratitude was involved. Gratitude implied the right to ask who you were, and Margaret had spent 11 years making sure no one asked that question. The parking lot was already hot, the June sun turning the asphalt into something that shimmered and bent. She drove without thinking about the route, just north on Victory Drive toward the edge of the city, toward Highway 80, toward any place that wasn't Cedar Creek Medical. The folded flag sat in a cardboard box on the passenger seat. Inside the box also, her discharge papers, her Didnt 214, her service medals that she'd never worn in public, all of it locked away like evidence at a crime scene. The evidence of a life that didn't exist anymore. The diner sat alone on Highway 80 like a ship that had washed ashore and decided to stay. Open 24 hours. The neon sign flickered. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed like they were counting down to something. Margaret sat in a corner booth, the kind where the vinyl was cracked and the view faced the parking lot. She ordered coffee at 3 a.m. when the night was so dark it felt like drowning. The waitress, a woman with purple streaks in her hair and eyes that had seen too many night shifts, refilled it twice without speaking. Some people understood silence better than conversation. Margaret stared at her reflection in the black window. A ghost staring back. Grey hair. Thin face. The eyes of someone who'd been erased so thoroughly that even she'd begun to believe she'd never existed at all. The question wasn't whether she'd done the right thing in that code room. The question was whether doing the right thing meant anything when the price was everything you had. When the cost was your career. Your name. Your presence in the world. Had disappearing been survival, or cowardice? She'd been ordered to vanish after Bagram, after Operation Nightingale, after the Pentagon decided that some operations were too classified to leave witnesses walking around in civilian life. She'd taken the order because soldiers took orders. She'd become a night nurse, invisible, unremarkable, the kind of person people forgot they'd seen. She'd buried Margaret Walsh so deeply that even Margaret Walsh sometimes forgot she was underneath. But the woman who'd performed that thoracotomy at 2:06 a.m., that woman had been someone. That woman had remembered. Her hands had remembered. The muscles in her shoulders had remembered. The muscle memory of keeping a bleeding operative alive in an Afghan field hospital had reached up through 11 years of invisibility and taken control. For 18 seconds, the real Margaret Walsh had surfaced. And it had cost her everything. The folded flag was pressed inside the box in her car, the one that had been handed to her by Master Sergeant Colin Reeves the day after her son's death, when Reeves had come to her house with his uniform immaculate and his eyes like stone. That flag was the only proof that any of it had mattered. That she'd once been someone who saved lives instead of watching them slip away behind hospital policy and a coward's paperwork. That she'd held people's hands at the moment of their worst fears. That she'd been brave once, in a place whose name she couldn't even mention. Her coffee had gone cold. The waitress didn't refill it this time. Back at Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Mercer walked into the administrative office and asked Holloway for Margaret's personnel file. "I'll handle the documentation personally," he said, his voice smooth as anesthesia. "Clean it up. Make sure everything's in order for the investigation." Holloway, relieved to have the problem delegated, handed it over without a second thought. Mercer carried the file to his office. Locked the door. And began to do what he'd actually been planning since the moment he realized Margaret Walsh had more competence in her smallest finger than he had in his entire career. He opened the files on 3 previous patient deaths, cases where he'd made errors in medication dosing, cases where families had questioned his medical judgment, cases that had quietly been settled without admission of fault. He began to alter the incident reports. He forged Margaret's signature on documents she'd never signed. He shifted the blame systematically, methodically, turning himself into the hero and her into the negligent nurse who'd been cutting corners, forging records, endangering patients. It was a good plan. It would have worked. It would have buried her so completely that even the Pentagon wouldn't have found her if they tried. But what Mercer didn't know was that Reeves's daughter had recorded everything from the moment the machine stopped beeping. And what Mercer didn't know was that a 16-year-old boy named David Walsh was already making phone calls, already carrying a showbox full of proof up the stairs toward the administrative office of Cedar Creek Medical, already burning with the kind of righteous fury that only comes when you realize your mother had been a hero the entire time and nobody, absolutely nobody, had bothered to ask. What happened next would end careers. The lobby doors opened at 8:33 a.m., and David Walsh walked through them carrying a showbox like it weighed 1,000 pounds. 16 years old, fury in his shoulders, eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic scanning the administrative desk where two receptionists pretended to work while actually watching everyone who moved. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't ask. The boy set the showbox down on the counter with a sound like a judge's gavel, definitive, final, and his voice came out steady and cold. My mother is Captain Margaret Walsh. She served 12 years in Special Forces. You need to see these. The receptionists froze. One reached for the phone but stopped when David's hand moved to the contents of the box. Ribbon spilled across the desk like blood on tile. Silver star. Bronze star with 2 oak leaf clusters. 2 purple hearts. Each one caught the fluorescent light and held it. The administrative assistant's mouth opened and closed like she was drowning in air. Within 90 seconds, nurses began appearing in doorways. An orderly stopped pushing a crash cart. The hospital administrator emerged from her office, already sensing something seismic shifting beneath the building's foundation, already understanding that whatever narrative she'd accepted about the nurse she'd fired was about to detonate into fragments. Mercer was still in the building. He was always in the building, that was his kingdom, these corridors, this authority held tight like a man drowning. When word traveled up 3 flights of stairs and found him in the physician's lounge reviewing radiology reports, his hand went very still. He didn't move. He didn't call anyone. He just stood, set down his coffee with the precision of a bomb disposal expert, and began walking toward the stairwell. His face was already changing color. The doors to the administrative wing opened and Sergeant Colin Reeves came through them in a wheelchair, his daughter pushing him with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd learned how to carry her father's weight. His spine was still healing. The movement should have caused pain, it did, his jaw clenching slightly, but his eyes were focused on one person in that room, and when he saw Margaret standing near the far corner, back against the wall like always, his eyes cleared completely. He lifted one hand, just barely, and whispered loud enough for the room to hear, Valkyrie 6. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that has weight. The kind that makes the fluorescent lights sound like they're screaming. A man in marine dress blue stepped forward from the cluster of hospital staff, a chaplain who'd been visiting the VA ward upstairs, someone nobody had noticed until that moment. He pulled up something on his phone, and his voice became the only sound in the building. Captain Margaret Walsh, Silver Star, Favela under fire while extracting wounded operatives under Taliban assault near Bagram Air Base, Logar Province, during Operation Nightingale, September 2014. He paused. His eyes found Margaret's across the room. You saved 7 men that day. 7 men came home because you refused to stay hidden. The second sentence he was reading was interrupted by the stairwell door slamming open hard enough to rattle the frame. Mercer came through it like something was chasing him, face already flushed purple, mouth already opening with words that would destroy him in front of 40 witnesses. This is fraud. This is stolen valor. I don't know what kind of con you're running, but I will. He stopped mid-sentence because a 2-star general in dress uniform had just walked through the main entrance, slow and deliberate, covered in ribbons of his own. The general's eyes found the medals on the desk, and he approached them like they were his own dead, and he raised his hand in a salute, not a lazy gesture but the full ceremonial kind, arm crisp, head bowed, the kind of salute that men only give to honor. Behind him came a woman in a navy suit carrying a folder stamped with clearances so high that the hospital administrator actually stepped backward. I'm Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, Pentagon liaison. Her voice was quiet but filled the room the way certain things do when authority is absolute. We need to discuss Dr. Mercer's attempts to alter Captain Walsh's personnel file and forge her military signatures on incident reports. She opened the folder. Her eyes found Mercer. The FBI has been investigating for 16 weeks. Mercer's face drained the way a bathtub drains when you pull the plug. His mouth opened but no sound came out. The administrator turned away from him completely, like looking at him might become a liability. Chen continued with the precision of someone reading from an indictment, 3 patient deaths in 18 months. All with altered documentation shifting responsibility to nursing staff. All documented. All recovered from your system before you deleted them. She paused. The originals are very different from your versions, Doctor. The main doors opened again. FBI agents. 2 of them, boots on tile, the sound echoing through the lobby like the footsteps of judgment itself. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this before, who understood that momentum mattered, that allowing the target to think was a tactical error. One of them spoke to the room, not directly to Mercer but to all of them, to the record, Dr. James Mercer, you're under arrest for federal fraud, obstruction of justice, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to conceal negligent homicide. Mercer tried to run. Actually, genuinely tried to run for the staff exit like his legs hadn't yet received the signal that his brain was already defeated. He made it 5 steps before agents blocked the hallway with their bodies, and the sound of handcuffs, that cold metallic click that nobody ever forgets, punctuated everything that came next. The metal bit into his wrists. He twisted, screaming about his credentials, about his reputation, about his decades of service, all of it words without power, all of it the noise of a man being dragged backward through the life he'd constructed. Local news cameras had somehow already positioned themselves in the parking lot. Margaret never found out who tipped them off, probably the Pentagon, probably on purpose, but they filmed him being walked out through the main lobby, past the patients he'd treated, past the families he'd promised results to, past every corridor and every moment of authority he'd ever wielded. A perp walk. That was what they called it. His face went through 6 different expressions: denial, rage, calculation, desperation, realization, and finally the blank mask of someone understanding that power disappears the moment people stop believing in it. Margaret stood at the 6th floor window with David's hand in hers. Her son had climbed the stairs to find her, leaving the medals below, understanding that his mother didn't need objects to prove what she was. They watched together as Mercer's unmarked sedan pulled out of the parking lot, as the news cameras turned their lights toward other stories, as the building began the process of recalibrating its entire understanding of who had been standing in it all along. Sergeant Reeves was wheeled up beside her, his daughter stepping back to give the moment its space. He looked at Margaret with the clarity of a man who'd survived by recognizing truth, and his voice was quiet enough that only she could hear. Some people build empires on lies. Some people save lives in the dark. You chose right, Captain. Margaret didn't respond. She looked down at the folded flag that David had carried up from the administrative desk, the flag that had belonged to her son's fallen teammate, the flag that Mercer had never known was the most powerful object in the building because it wasn't about decoration, it was about honor. She held it the way soldiers hold things they've carried through impossible places. She held it like a promise kept. 2 years later, Mercer taught CPR at a community college for minimum wage. His medical license was gone. His name was a warning in ethics courses. He demonstrated chest compressions on rubber dummies to students who looked at their phones and didn't care about the hollow man walking between the tables, and he couldn't tell them who he'd been. His plea agreement prohibited it, a clause Margaret's lawyer had specifically negotiated. He lived in silence. Powerless silence. The kind that tastes like copper and regret. Margaret returned to Cedar Creek Medical wearing her credentials openly now. Captain Margaret Walsh, RN, BSN, Combat Medical Specialist. The hospital created a veteran liaison program in her name. She worked the night shift by choice, still quiet, still spotless, her gray hair still pinned tight, but no longer invisible. The folded flag hung in Sergeant Reeves's room, and he visited monthly with his daughter to thank the woman who'd saved his life twice, once in that hospital room, once by choosing to exist in the light instead of disappearing into shadow. Her son enlisted at 18 and told his unit stories about his mother, about what it meant to serve silently, about the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself until the moment it's needed. In the break room at Cedar Creek, nurses asked her about Bagram, about the missions, about what it felt like to be erased and then suddenly restored. Margaret looked at them with steady eyes and spoke the word she'd learned in places without names: power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The grey in her hair had spread like silver, but her hands never trembled. Her scrubs were still spotless. She saved lives in the dark and in the light, and both versions mattered exactly the same. On the unit board where Mercer had posted her humiliation, there was now a commendation from the Surgeon General, a photograph of her at the White House receiving the National Nurse of the Year award, and a handwritten note from a 2-star general, Valkyrie 6, still saving lives. Still a legend. If this story resonated with you, if you know someone like Captain Walsh, someone whose strength has been invisible, whose sacrifice went unrecognized, please like this video and subscribe. Share it with the people who need to know that quiet competence matters. And comment, have you ever underestimated someone only to find out they were a hero the entire time? Because the people who matter always know. Eventually, the truth always surfaces.